Well, good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. Good day to people in the United States, and welcome to people around the world participating in this webinar. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and we are really proud to partner with the Brandenburg Institute for Society and Security on this webinar. Very glad to see Tim Stuchtai, Executive Director, with us today. Our title is Trust as the Foundation of the Transatlantic Partnership in the Digital World. Those of you who have followed the summits in the last few days, including yesterday's summit between the US and the European Union, will recognize the importance of digital issues as at the center of the transatlantic relationship, and in particular the agreement yesterday to form a Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council between the US and the EU. I'm going to hand things over to Peter Rashish in just a moment, but let me just say how excited we are to have senior German and United States government officials speaking today to help us understand the way forward on digital issues. And with that, I'd like to give the microphone to Peter Rashish, Director of the Geoeconomics Program at AICGS. Peter, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeff, and hello to everyone. We are very pleased to convene this event with Biggs and with us, Tim Stuchtai, who's with us today. This event is part of the Wunderbar Together 2021 program supported by the German Federal Foreign Office in partnership with the Goethe Institute. Wunderbar Together held the Deutschlandjahr, or Year of Germany, series of events across the United States in 2019 and is continuing its engagement this year. And today's webinar is actually the first of two that AICGS and Biggs will organize this year. In October, we'll convene a second one focusing on artificial intelligence, which I hope all of you can take part in. We are very delighted to have as our speakers today Stephen Anderson, who's the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Communications and Information Policy, as well as Stephan Mayer, who's a Parliamentary State Secretary in the German Ministry of the Interior. We have a slight change to the program today, as Mr. Mayer will need to leave for an unexpected appointment at either 12:30 or 5:30, or sort of 6:30 rather, depending on where you are. His colleague, Andreas Koenen, has agreed to join us at that point, and we thank you for that. Our focus today will be the opportunities and constraints surrounding US-German and US-European technology cooperation, with a special focus on 5G telecommunications. As Jeff mentioned, over the weekend, over the weekend, the G7 summit took place, and at that summit they recognized the importance of secure supply for telecommunications infrastructure, including 5G. And as Jeff mentioned, at yesterday's US-EU summit, President Biden and his European counterparts launched this new Trade and Technology Council, which could provide a forum for not only transatlantic information sharing, but perhaps also some joint thinking about ways to regulate telecommunications, including 5G. So I think we're having this event at a opportune moment. Let me introduce our first speaker. Stephen C. Anderson is as I said, the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of International Communications and Information Policy in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department. He is, in this capacity, he leads development of international internet, data, and privacy policies and related negotiations with foreign governments. Previously, he was a director of the Office of Specialized and Technical Agencies in the State Department's Bureau for International Organization Affairs, and he has also served as a visiting fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and in several posts in embassies abroad, including Mexico, Germany, Argentina, Italy, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And he is the recipient of numerous State Department superior and meritorious honor awards. We're very glad to have you back with us at AICGS, and the floor is yours.
Peter, thank you so much. They always say never believe your bio, and I guess I'm not going to believe it when you say it either. But really, it's a pleasure to be here with you and such a distinguished panel to discuss such an important issue. Let me just start up front that the Biden-Harris administration approach to technology diplomacy, and specifically to 5G security, is that these are of summum importance for us and for all of our partners, including countries like Germany. The Brandenburg Institute for Society and Security has been a great voice on this topic, and I'm happy to be here with you, Peter, and the AICG as well to talk about this particular issue. So let me state up front that the Biden-Harris administration considers 5G security a top priority. And just this Sunday, Secretary of State Blinken signed a 5G security memorandum of understanding with the Albanian Prime Minister as an example of how it is that we plan to bring this initiative forward. 5G networks will facilitate revolutions in our economic models, enabling all the potential of the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence that we've been talking about. But of course, that will only happen if 5G networks are secure, and we can only have secure networks if they're built with trusted vendors. Now, from day one of his administration, President Biden has sent a clear message to the world that the United States will recommit to our alliances and partnerships and revitalize them to meet the challenges of our time, including the challenges of 5G network security. Now, myself as a committed transatlanticist, it really was a pleasure to see the whole series of actions that were taken up at the G7, the NATO, and the European Union summits over the last week. The commitment to work with partners is also true on 5G networks, and I'm really excited about the TTC and all of these other initiatives that have been announced. I think we're going to have a lot of work on our plates, but it's better to have full agendas. Ich sage, ich bin auch deutsche Abstammung und ich freue mich sehr darauf, dass wir diese Möglichkeit haben, also so ganz eine starke Beziehung mit Deutschland noch weiterzuführen. Germany remains, for the United States, our largest trading partner in Europe, and the United States is Germany's largest export market. Our relations politically, socially, and economically are of huge importance. It's not just with the European Union, it's with individual countries like Germany. Now, Germany and the United States support a shared vision of an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet. Open communications reflect our shared values. Now, strategic competition with the People's Republic of China overlays all of these discussions, the ones we're having today, and the discussions that the president had with European leaders, the G7, NATO, and the European Union. This is, of course, reflected as well in the communiques from all of those meetings. Now, we have seen how Beijing and Moscow are increasingly using access to critical resources, markets, and technologies to pressure our allies and to drive wedges between us, and to even call into question our own democratic processes. In particular, the PRC uses its market size, dominance in key nodes of international supply chains, and centralized control over economic activity to advance Beijing's political goals and to benefit its economic champions. When we give in to these pressures, we embolden our adversaries. Instead, in Secretary Blinken's words, let us, quote, cooperate to develop cutting-edge innovations, ensure that our supply chains are resilient, and set the norms and standards that will govern emerging technologies and impose costs on those who break those rules. History tells us that when we do, more countries will opt for the open and secure spaces that we build together, end quote. Now, as the Secretary also made clear, technology is at the center of this global competition, and we should have no illusions about the PRC's objectives, which are to undercut the West's long-standing technological advantage and to displace our model's commitment to respecting human rights, privacy, and innovation with its authoritarian vision. Back here in the United States, the president is committed to ensuring we build back better so that our economy is strong and that we are prepared to win strategic competition with the PRC based on our strengths. That is why the President has expressed support for bipartisan legislation known as the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. This will help support semiconductor production and further National Science Foundation support for research and development. The President's America Supply Chain Executive Order will also ensure that we have domestic capabilities we need in semiconductors and other important sectors. We will also continue supporting U.S. businesses and ensuring fairness in trade, investment, and global competition, especially in ICT and data matters. Now, turning specifically to 5G, I want to give a nod to the paper that Biggs put out in January on the hidden costs of untrusted vendors. Full disclosure, the State Department was very supportive of that initiative from the very beginning. But putting a price on insecurity is not easy, but it is one of the concerns that we hear about all over the world. Now, I think Tim's concept of Huawei shock is particularly useful and certainly tied to the sentiment that the Secretary was trying to convey. Now, it's very dangerous to summarize somebody's paper in front of them in one paragraph, but if you'll permit me to summarize it, what we see as Huawei shock, it's that sense that regulators feel when they realize just how critical communications are to their national economies, while also realizing how vulnerable they will be if those networks are built under the rules of authoritarian governments. Now, there is an antidote for this, and it's the Prague Consensus. The first Prague 5G Security Conference produced what we call the Prague Proposals, which have grown in acceptance, and at this point, I think they represent a broadening consensus about the security risks of untrusted vendors. The conference happened because many countries had experienced Huawei shock and decided that they needed to do something about it. Since then, the United States has signed about 14 5G joint statements and memorandums of understanding with countries and other jurisdictions all over the world with reference to the Prague Proposals. And of course, numerous other countries have taken strong actions to limit untrusted vendors in their 5G networks without having signed a 5G memorandum of understanding with the United States. The EU's 5G security toolbox is a parallel document that outlines best practices. Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom have also implemented regulations that are in keeping with the conclusions of that conference. Now, if you'll permit me, Germany's latest IT Security Act will certainly fit within this Prague Consensus. The law provides effective instruments to address untrusted suppliers in telecommunications networks. Now, when we think about what are the practical implications of sort of the ideas put forward in the Prague Consensus, I think we first think that it acknowledges that communications-based threats exist at both a technical and non-technical level. And secondly, that as communications technologies become more important to all citizens by building more and more connections in our lives, the danger posed by disruptions increases. Follows from the first and the second points that a proper risk assessment is necessary, and that risk assessment has to be broad enough to consider features like the social and legal framework, the accountability, respect for the rule of law, and past corporate behavior by that company. It is not just up to companies, of course, or excuse me, to governments to recognize the problem of security. In the United States and in Europe, the private sector is answering our call for more innovative secure communications infrastructure. If a technical gap ever existed in the 5G space, I think Ericsson and Nokia have certainly closed it. And then if you look at a lot of the newer startups, with encouragement of companies like Vodafone, Deutsche Telekom, and Telefonica, telecommunications networks are opening up to new market entrants and considering life cycle costs as opposed to just installation costs. Now, we were very pleased to see the major European mobile network operators pledge to cooperate on developing and implementing Open RAN in a memorandum of understanding earlier this year. Open networks will spur innovation, prevent vendor lock-in, and provide opportunities for more new entrants into this market from Europe and from the United States. Now, I'll stop there, but I do want to summarize. 5G remains a top US priority. We want to work with allies to secure 5G networks in order to enable an innovation economy. This can only happen with trusted vendors who participate in our build-outs, and we support further vendor diversity through support for Open RAN and other 5G architectures that will bring in new entrants. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Stephen, thank you very much for those remarks. And they do prompt a couple of questions I would look forward to asking you, but in the interest, which I'm sure we all would share, of having you and State Secretary Mayer spend as much time together, let me hand the floor over to Tim Stuchda, who will introduce him, and then afterwards we can begin to have some conversation. So Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, Stephan Mayer is a member of the Christian Social Union, and for the American viewers, we need to explain that's the sister party of the CDU, Mrs. Merkel's, the Chancellor's party in Bavaria. And he's been in the Bundestag since 2002, where he served as a spokesman for Home Affairs in his parliamentary group, and is representing the electoral district Alt-Oetting-Mühlendorf am Inn, which is just east of Munich, and a beautiful area that all Americans should visit. In the fourth Merkel administration, he serves as a Parliamentary State Secretary in the Federal Ministry of the Interior under Horst Seehofer, the minister. And thank you, Mr. Mayer, for being here, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, dear Tim, dear Peter Reschisch, dear Stephen C. Anderson, dear ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I want to thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored very much. It's really tremendous pleasure for me to have the possibility to contribute to this outstanding conference. On the other hand, certainly I want to thank you, Tim, for introducing me so politely. The IT Security Act 2.0, which was mentioned by Stephen just before, was passed by the German Bundestag only recently, only a few weeks ago, and it strengthens the German legal framework regarding cybersecurity in a very comprehensive way. I would say I would perceive this legislative dossier as, I would say, one of the 5 most important which in our portfolio, in the portfolio of the Ministry of the Interior for Building and Community in this legislative term. With the IT Security Act 2.0, we keep pace with the technological developments, and it strengthens the legal framework in 3 areas. Firstly, the protection of critical infrastructures, including critical components, the so-called 5G, and the companies of special public interest. Secondly, the protection of the consumers, and thirdly, the protection of the federal IT systems. It's our main objective that we have to secure our critical infrastructures, and especially the 5G networks, in a comprehensive way. All risks, both technical and non-technical, must be averted. Without security, the benefits and the advantages of the digitalization cannot come into full effect. Information security is an essential condition for the success and the acceptance of digitalization. The new 5G networks will offer numerous opportunities and new applications for industry and the whole society. For example, in the area of mobility or the factories of the future. Given the enormous importance of these networks, they must be as secure as possible. Now I want to say something about the German approach to the 5G security, the trustworthiness of the vendors. Securing the upcoming 5G networks is a common challenge for all countries, especially for the industrialized countries. The IT Security Act 2.0 deals with the cybersecurity of 5G networks regarding the certification of so-called critical components, as well as the trustworthiness of the vendors. The new security requirements of the for the construction and the operation of the 5G networks are essentially in line with the EU 5G toolbox. First, I want to say something about the technical requirements like certification. In the future, the certification of so-called critical components will be mandatory in Germany. Otherwise, such a component cannot be used in the networks. The critical components in the telecommunication sector will be derived from a dynamic list of critical functions. The definition of the critical functions is a technical task of responsibility of the Federal Network Agency, the Bundesnetzagentur, and the Federal Office for Information Security, the BSI. Components that perform one of the critical functions listed there have to be regarded as critical components, and their use can be prohibited in accordance with the provisions of the IT Security Act 2.0. And more to that I will stress out later. The list of the critical functions will be updated regularly. The certification of these components is intended to ensure that certain requirements and in particular security features have been implemented. Furthermore, the catalog of security requirements for telecommunication networks was recently updated in Germany, which also takes up various measures of the EU 5G toolbox. These include requirements to avoid monocultures as well as requirements for the introduction of security monitoring within the networks. In addition to general technical measures, the so-called high-risk vendors will also be addressed. The trustworthiness of the manufacturer of critical components, regardless of the country of origin, plays a very important role in the future. The more complex a component is designed and has to be managed by the manufacturer through software updates and patches in the life cycle, the greater will be the manufacturer's ability to influence the component. For this reason, within the framework of the IT Security 2.0 Act, a suitable procedure will be established in order to be able to exclude the use of certain critical components as an ultima ratio if they pose a threat to national security. So this is the ex ante view of this legal dossier, the IT Security Act 2.0. This way, the IT Security Act 2.0 does not directly and in general lead to ban a certain vendor, but the new legal framework enables the Federal Ministry of the Interior to take a very close look at the vendors and evaluate potential threats to national security. The Federal Ministry of the Interior can, in consultation with the ministries concerned, depending on the sectoral joint responsibility, prohibit the use of critical components within 2 months after the notification or the issue other orders if the use of the critical component is likely to pose a threat to national security. This can especially be the case if, for instance, the vendor is under control of a third country, or the vendor involved in activities the vendor is involved in activities that had or has negative effects on national security in Germany or another member states of the European Union, the EFTA or NATO or their institutions. Or for instance, if the deployment is not in line with the security policy goals of Germany, the EU or NATO. Next to this ex ante approach, a so-called guarantee declaration is intended to outline certain aspects of trustworthiness. If certain violations of this declaration are found or a threat to national security is identified during the ongoing operation of the networks, this could lead to the prohibition of the use of the relevant critical components. This is the ex post view of this new legal dossier. Due to the new legislation, vendors of critical components can be excluded in individual cases. This requires a detailed examination in every individual case, the result of which can, of course, not be anticipated at this point. There is no general pre-exclusion of certain vendors from certain regions or countries. Nonetheless, the legal requirements for an exclusion are very focused and give the Federal Ministry of the Interior a powerful tool to avert potential threats to national security. And lastly, I want to make a few remarks, as Stephen did it as well, on the transatlantic cooperation in general, and certainly especially with regard to cybersecurity and with regard to coping to cyber attacks. Germany and the United States continue to work closely together and very confidentially together on various levels on the important topic of cybersecurity. And I would call me typical Transatlanticer, as we say in Germany. So I'm really very glad and appreciate very much that we work together very closely, the United States and Germany, as Stephen said, with regard to a lot of different political fields, socially, culturally, and certainly we are linked together very intensively to our two economies. But I also want to stress out that especially with regard to the cooperation of our security and intelligence agencies, our cooperation is very strong, and I hope that we will be able to intensify and to enhance our cooperation in the next years. The Federal Office for Information Security and the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency of the USA maintain a very close exchange, particularly on technical and analytical issues. There's also a close cooperation on cyber issues between the Federal Ministry of the Interior and the Department of Homeland Security within the framework of the so-called Security Cooperation Group, including legal regulations and concerning strategies. And there is also a constructive exchange and a very fruitful exchange on the question of the trustworthiness of the various manufacturers in the area of 5G network technology. I want to thank you very much for your attendance, and unfortunately I have to head on to another appointment. It was just fixed recently, but I will be replaced now by Mr. Köhnen, and it's not only a replacement. Mr. Köhnen is our director responsible for all these issues of cybersecurity, coping with cyber attacks, and he was the main and the most important staff member in our ministry who pushed forward this IT Security 2.0 Act. So thank you very much again for having me as part of this conference, and I wish you all the best for the future and very delightful and instructive conference.
Stephan Mayer, thank you very much for being here and speaking to us. Of course, I have a follow-up question, which I will now ask Andreas Köhnen, and hopefully it's not too political for him to answer it. Otherwise, we will have another opportunity at some other time to continue the discussion. So thank you very much for being here. And I was about to say, enjoy the rest of your evening. I know it's not really enjoying. You have to keep working. So thank you very much, and bye-bye. Yeah, he was already introduced Andreas Köhnen. He's been head of the Department Cyber and IT Security at the Federal Ministry of the Interior since 2018. Before joining BMI, Ministry of the Interior, Mr. Köhnen was the Vice President of the already several times mentioned Federal Office for Information Security. He is a mathematician by training, and I guess one could call him the father of the IT Security Law 2.0. So Stephan Mayer was right. He is a great replacement to jump in here and continue the discussion with Stephen Anderson. Peter, I know you had a follow-up question for Stephen before we go to Andreas Köhnen, so maybe it's time now to ask that question.
Okay, thanks. I hope I can squeeze in two. Stephen, thanks again. As Jeff and I both alluded to, it's been a season of summits. Over the weekend, we had the G7 summit in Cornwall. Then on Monday in Brussels, the NATO summit, followed also in Brussels by the US-EU summit yesterday. And I wondered if you see any message coming out of these three gatherings of like-minded countries for US 5G policy, and particularly for US cooperation with Germany and the EU on these issues. And then, if you permit me, I'll have a follow-up question.
Sure, thank you. I think that, as I alluded to in my comments, the summit of the last week was really, as the president said multiple times, the evidence that the United States is back and working hard in order to cooperate, collaborate with our allies and partners. As I think some in the community that studies German-American relations say, we're trying to have a more ambitious agenda. I think the Trade and Technology Council, the breadth and the depth of the issues that we're going to be speaking in that testify to the ambition that we have for the relationship under the Biden-Harris administration. Specifically on 5G, I think that the communique covers from the EU summit covers a variety of issues, but it's 5G features in there as one of the components, and it actually features in several ways, and it shows how the Biden-Harris administration is committed to work together with our partners. As that very detailed presentation from State Secretary Mayer made clear, Germany and the United States are in absolute sort of sympathy in syntonia on the perception of the security risks from 5G, from untrusted vendors. So the question then is how do we work together with countries like Germany who share that same concern, who also share the same values as the United States, in order to work with other countries on the security argument to develop alternative technologies within 5G that enable other vendors to be able to move in. The current number of vendors in the market is limited. There are 5 sort of full stack vendors operating in the world. 2 essentially who've been operating in Europe. I guess Samsung just signed to go in with Vodafone in the UK, so that makes 3. 3 does not a diverse market make, and I think that what you'll see as a result of the TTC and other forms of cooperation that we have through the G7 and otherwise, and that the United States, Germany, Europe are going to work together on issues like vendor diversity, continuing, of course, the security argument. I'll stop there, although I could keep going on and on.
Well, thanks. Let me just drill down on perhaps one aspect of this. The Biden administration is making supply chains a pretty big piece of its approach to trade and technology. There's an ongoing supply chain review. An important document was just produced very recently on this. How do you see the Biden administration's approach to security and resilience of supply chains for technologies, and specifically for 5G, in a transatlantic context?
So excellent question. And I apologize if I'm going to parse your question in order to answer it, because you're talking about supply chains, and there are different arguments that are brought to bear when one thinks of supply chain. In 5G, what we've traditionally been worried about is the trustworthiness of the supply chain. That there are certain companies who had come to have dominant roles in the market that were not trustworthy. And we did not think that for an infrastructure that was so fundamental to our economic and national security, that these untrusted vendors should participate in it. So that's a question of trusted supply chains. But we also need, as you mentioned in your question, we need resilient supply chains. And to a certain extent, the vendor diversity question is a part of that. One of the reasons why we had the risk of untrusted vendors was because there wasn't enough vendor diversity in the market. The market itself wasn't sort of strong and resilient. The president's supply chain EO is about resilient supply chains, as them also being necessary for our national and our economic security. The president made it very clear as candidate Biden that he wanted to ensure that we had sort of a manufacturing base in the United States in order to make us less dependent on sort of non-resilient supply chains. I think all of us at the beginning of the pandemic saw the risk of not having redundancies in there. And so I think we're going to work on the supply chain EO makes it very clear that we're going to work on that. Now, as far as the transatlantic relationship goes, I think that this is a really important point, and I'm very glad that you framed the question in that way. I used some fairly strong language about the People's Republic of China in my opening comments, and I associated the United States with Germany and Europe in values. There isn't a third way. There are some politicians that we hear in Europe who talk about sort of a PRC model, an American model, and that Europe needs to find its own model, and it needs to look for technological sovereignty. That's not what we believe in the United States. We believe that the United States and Europe need to work together with our shared values, and we need to come up with ways to ensure that our sort of joint supply chains are resilient. There are going to be certain national interests that are always going to come into play, but I think that the important thing is that we work together in order to ensure that we have resilient supply chains rooted in sort of trusted vendors, trusted partners like the United States and Europe. Just one more point, when the State Secretary was referring to the in detail, it was more impressive to hear him explain it than it was just to read it, I have to say, that they see the importance of allied partners in NATO and the European Union, and that's a concept we share as well. I'll go ahead and stop there and look forward to any other questions as well.
And let me bring Andreas Köhn into the conversation here now. I'm reframing a little bit the original question I had for Stephan Mayer, because it was more directed towards the politician. But let me put it that way. Secretary Mayer laid out the rules, the institutional framework that is now set into the IT Security Law 2.0, how the decision is being made, what is a trustworthy component to be integrated into the German public 5G networks. That is an institutional framework. How dependent is that process from who is in charge of the Ministry of the Interior or who is Chancellor of Germany? So how political remains the question, or is it from now on just a more or less purely administrative decision-making process?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, and also for having me here and the friendly introduction before. Clearly that stays a political question in the end. If you look into the process the IT security law now establishes, then you see that there's on one hand the pillar of certification. That's a technical part. And concerning those technical questions, I think it's a very decisive task to define what a critical component is, what made up by critical functions. It's very clear-cut process to come up with requirements for a certification and ending up with a certification. So far, I would say no politics seen so far. But actually, if you switch over to the trustworthiness question, then immediately, especially in the ex-ante process, Ms. State Secretary Mayer mentioned, then you have the political decision in the very beginning. Clearly, if we look the first time in our process on a specific vendor, we have to deliver the process where we decide whether this vendor is trustworthy or whether he is a high-risk vendor. That means we have, for example, in this beginning process that will start within the next few months, we have to ask our intelligence services what they know about those vendors. We have to ask our friends in the US, we have to ask our friends in NATO what they know about vendors, and then clearly this ex-ante decision will be made of looking at the facts that are on the table after asking around and getting a full picture of what the vendor actually does in his home country and as well with his customers. And trustworthiness is mostly a question how a company behaves with the customers, what can be said about the way the company deals with its customers, and how trustworthiness is produced in that circumstance. So clearly we would see within the next 3 months the first critical component showing up. The certification process will run very quickly because we have anything in hand what we need. That's common criteria, for example, something that we established together with the United States, the United Kingdom and all our EU partners. That can run very quickly. And then we have the moment of truth, whether we see trustworthiness or not.
So since you mentioned the European partners, how much is this process synchronized with other European member states? Will we end up with a colorful landscape in Europe where some countries will use untrusted technologies while others don't? Or is that something where you and your colleagues in the on the European level try to synchronize the decision-making process?
We are in a very lucky situation concerning the technical process because 2 years ago the Cybersecurity Act came into effect in the European Union. That's no question. That will run very quickly, and ENISA is the driving force in that. Concerning this political decision, it will get more complicated because the EU is not in a position to make up a harmonized regime on that. That means we have to negotiate again between the 27 how we will deal with this question. And I see, and Stephen Anderson already mentioned that, that we have the Prague process and the Prague proposals in the room. So it could even not end at the borders at the EU to have such a synchronization process, but even to go further and, for example, ask our Japanese colleagues and Singaporean colleagues. They are very important because they are strong nations in the digitization process. They have experience with 5G already, and so that's a very important question where we have to come up with some questions and would be very glad for answers coming from there and as I already mentioned, from the other side of the Atlantic. So now the Commission is in a position to synchronize all those different opinions. We will see different opinions, no question at all, but to have in the end one single voice of the European Union talking to all those other mentioned, and especially to the vendors' home countries.
Before I pose my next question, we've been doing this now for over a year and still it happens. I want the audience know that if you have a pressing question, you can type it into the Q&A part, and I will pose your question. Probably not all of them, because we have only very little time, but if you have some, please feel free to put them there. The IT security law only regulates public networks, 5G networks. But one aspect of 5G is that it could be very important for the factory of the future, for the Industry 4.0 production process to be used within factories by building a small campus network or private network on a site, on a production site of some factory. Of course, these networks are somehow linked to the rest of the world, but they are not regulated. So the owner of the factory gets what he pays for, so they can make up their mind completely freely what they want to use or not. I want to hear both of you there, but Andreas, maybe you want to go first.
It's a typical German issue. I would like to, and I'm glad to hear your opinion, Stephen, about this typical German fact. Actually, you are quite correct. And what I'm saying now is a position of the Ministry of the Interior. And I didn't ask my colleague at the Ministry of the Economics whether he would agree, because he is responsible for the telecommunications law. And whether we regulate campus networks or not is a question of the telecommunications law. So it's not mine. If I could act as I wanted, I would immediately protect also those infrastructures. One has had to see whether this is of public interest. It is a critical component, in my opinion, at least. Then we should do it by extending the telecommunications law. But there's another way. If it's a critical infrastructure, we also could regulate it via the IT security law in future in the next legislation period. So I believe it's really important to digitize infrastructure. We have to regulate it. We have to come up with requirements, make it as secure as the rest of the infrastructure.
Stephen, what's...
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't want to comment specifically on the German law, but what I would say is that from our perspective and from what we hear from our intelligence and security officials, that you really cannot isolate the risks in 5G networks when you have untrusted vendors in there. So our belief is that if you want 5G security or secure 5G networks, you have to fully exclude untrusted vendors from all parts of the network, full stop. I would add that I think there's, I'll use the word growing consensus, but I think there's a growing recognition is probably the better way to phrase it among people in the IT community and sort of here in Washington, that we also need to think a little bit beyond just 5G. 5G was a good place to start. There were particularities of the 5G network, the sort of the attack surface, the distributed network, the moving from the, the computing from the core to the edge, and the fact that we were just beginning to roll it out made it opportune that the first place we looked was 5G networks. But we need to I think, begin to have the discussion about subsea cables. We're already having that in the United States. We need to think about cloud computers. The president just signed an executive order last week that replaced some earlier executive orders, but it also looks at the security of certain kinds of apps that we have on our phones. So to broaden your question, it's not just a question of whether public networks and private 5G networks need to be reviewed. We need to take a holistic look at networks and figure out the best way to ensure that they're secure. You can't have cybersecurity along the various layers of the internet if your base physical layer, the tubes, so to speak, are not secure. And I think we need to have that conversation, domestically and with partners throughout the world. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add very shortly on that. Actually, the IT security law is already prepared to take over the same regulation for, let's say, the health sector, where it's digitized, or for energy transport, for example. What we only need is the corresponding special laws that regulate the health sector. Just say, okay, look at the IT security law. We want to go along exactly that way, and we define our own critical components, and we can look at the vendors with the same measures we are doing in the 5G arena.
Stephen, if I may follow up on my question concerning private networks. So is there regulation in the United States that, I don't know, the Siemens side or the Boeing side in one of the states in the US that when they build a private 5G network to control their machinery, that they can only use certain trusted technology, or is that just, let's say, a warning from the US government to do so? More on that.
I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's a warning from the US government, but I do think that if you look at actions that the Biden-Harris administration has taken since January 20th, there is an increasing focus on the risk to Americans of their data and their networks. It's not just a question of losing our data, it's the ability to disrupt our networks. What happened with the Colonial Pipeline in the East Coast of the United States wasn't as complex or as difficult for the hackers to get in as we would have liked. But if those same hackers were the people who had designed the system, it obviously makes it easier. Your architect knows where you put your safe in the bank. It's the same thing with the security networks, the networks of critical infrastructure. We have a national security interest in critical infrastructure being secured. If those networks, if those infrastructures are connected with insecure networks, we need to take a look at it. Not a threat, but I think it's a statement that we need to reflect on.
Maybe to broaden from the little private network, to broaden the horizon here a little bit. Some other countries have made the decision already, basically to ban Huawei, like Australia or like Sweden. And they have gotten under a lot of pressure from the Chinese government for doing so. Andreas Köhn, are you afraid that the same could happen if the outcome of the decision-making process would be unfavorable for Chinese companies, that the same would happen to Germany? And Stephen, what are we doing to help our partners, allies, in that, to not let them alone in this struggle that they already have, like Australia or Sweden? Andreas, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah. First of all, I'm convinced that we have set a very clear-cut measure with our IT security law, and that we have a very objective process. I know that this was looked upon from the Chinese side very carefully during the whole process, and also in what came out in the end. And in my opinion, those vendors that are interested to stay in the German market will show up, will show their certificates, or go up to the BSI and ask for this certification process. On one hand, they will go on and try to stay in the German market, and in the end, they will accept also the trustworthiness process and the decision that might come out of that process. I'm very confident that they have understood what we have set into the room, and there now is a real procedure to follow on, and that this is an objective thing, and that it's on their side whether they can prove their trustworthiness and not in the end of our side. So that's important. So I have no fear of the outcome of the whole process. But I would like to make one other remark. What we see is that actually in the critical parts of the network, the number of equipment coming from there is shrinking. And actually, it's more a question towards the providers at the moment, how they will behave with respect to vendors from one or the other country. And then they already have drawn their conclusions. And that's an important thing to look upon.
So, Tim, the People's Republic of China has reacted in the same way to companies who've decided that they don't want to have forced labor participating in their supply chain for clothing. I think what you have to ask yourself is, do you want to entrust your most vital communications network to a country that would threaten you for a sovereign decision not to use their product? And I think that goes along with the whole question that we came through before about the trustworthiness of the company, and that depends on the sort of the nature of the regime where they operate. And then, you know, the United States, we work closely with our allies who take bold decisions and work with them to figure out the best ways to sort of stand up to that kind of bullying. But to keep it 5G specific on this one, there's safety in numbers. Working with allies and partners, I think, is the way that we can secure our networks and protect ourselves against retaliation. But again, I think that's part of it. If as countries we make decisions to use our network, you know, to use trusted vendors, and the untrusted vendors wants to retaliate for that, I think that's just a reason, one more reason not to use them.
Thank you for that. And our time is already running out. So the late questions that are now coming in, I'm sorry, too late. We have to do this again, I guess. But I cannot let this opportunity pass without asking one question, since I'm having someone from the State Department and the Ministry of the Interior sitting in front of me. There are a lot of transatlanticists here in this virtual room, and we very much would like to no longer meet in virtual rooms, but physically travel to Washington, or invite you, Stephen, to come and discuss this with us here in Berlin. When will traveling across the Atlantic be open again, and what it was like before the pandemic?
Well, I'll just say that I really wish that I had the opportunity to be in Brandenburg. The weather's nice in Washington today, but I think that it would be nice to be there. That's not a decision within my competency. I think that my government, your government, are looking to find the best way to open up travel as quickly as it can be done safely.
I was hoping for something more, but yeah, all right.
It's the same for us. Clearly, it's a decision of the whole government, especially the Ministry of Health, to decide about that. But one can always say what one would like to have. And what I would like to have is that I could travel to the United States at the end of summer. That might be realistic. The vaccination has covered a whole part of our both countries and people, and so that we then, under clear-cut circumstances, we have the ability to exchange again. That was a process State Secretary Mayer mentioned already. For example, the Security Cooperation Group. I would like to sit there and negotiate with you on the others, being on the other side, and so we will see. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to even closer cooperation during the next few years.
So there's hope not only on the 5G front, but also in meeting us in person again. And with that glimmer of hope, I thank the two of you and give it back to Peter.
Well, thanks, Tim, and let me see if I can brighten that glimmer of hope, but at least in a little bit longer term, by saying that even if we couldn't do this meeting in person, that we hope that many of you in Germany will be able to travel to Washington in October, when, as I mentioned, we'll have our second webinar focusing on artificial intelligence, and I think we'll also be able to include a number of you virtually as well. So let me thank Stephen Anderson again, Andreas Koenen, Tim, for our great cooperation, and Wunderbar together for helping to make this possible. And wish you a good afternoon or evening on either side of the Atlantic. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
It's a pleasure.
Very much. Bye.